And I was racing for Williams, but I was sitting on the side of the McLaren lawyers and Martin Whitmarsh, who worked with Ron Dennis, whilst the lawyers of the Contract Recognition Board looked at the paperwork that Williams had, looked at the paperwork that McLaren had, and decided that actually McLaren's contract was valid and that I would drive for them in 96, 97. I then went to the airport and flew with Frank, who was in the meeting, to the next Grand Prix. The whole thing was totally...
Can't make it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally unnecessary.
Welcome everybody to this week's F1 Beyond the Grid, and I'm delighted to say we are joined by 13-time Grand Prix winner David Coulthard. DC, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. I think I'm probably in slightly better shape than you because I've not just run a marathon. So have you got blisters and cramps and all sorts of
all of
side
the
effects?
above. Difficult to walk, I have to say. But I've got the bug, actually. Marathon running is where it's at. And I think I can say the same for Sebastian Vettel, probably.
Yeah, very impressive what he did. And should we be surprised, though? Because he's still a young man. He's got all of the sort of competitive genes that understands focus, discipline, preparation, and then, of course, through to the execution. So maybe this has become his next bug, you know. He's going to be aiming for, what would be an impressive amateur time? Because he did under 3 hours,
He did under 3. There's a stack of people, I think, that get to about 2:30. Mm-hmm. And then, but he'll now be thinking I can do 2:30. And do you know what? We're not here to talk about marathons, by the way, but his ability to absorb information. He treated it like a Grand Prix, actually, the marathon, in terms of his preparation. And I learned a lot about him and about preparation, really. Yeah. But DC, fun enough, we're talking about a racing driver in him because you are someone who has lived and worked in Formula One for more than 30 years. Very few people know this paddock better than you. And I wanted to discuss how drivers get themselves into the right place at the right time. You know, when you look at a Max Verstappen, it looks easy, but there are a lot of very talented drivers who never get there. How difficult is it?
It's incredibly difficult. There's no question that the racing gods or a bit of racing luck is needed. You're being in the right place at the right time, available with the right preparation. But should we be surprised that people who are prepped, people that are training for that moment, are therefore able to deliver when the opportunity comes along? And I think that's the key thing. If we look at the current grid, if we go back to when Carlos Sainz was at Ferrari, he has appendicitis, gets pulled out of the car, and suddenly with no prior understanding that he was about to make his Grand Prix debut, you have Oliver Bearman jump in the car and go out and deliver. And then suddenly that cements very strongly the foundations of what I'm sure will be a long career. All the rumours are that he will be at Ferrari in the future. The thing that stands in the way of him is, well, if Lewis has a great year, then he'll probably want to go again for another year. And then, unless Charles is out of contract and decides to go somewhere else, which is possible but seems unlikely, then he's maybe going to have to be a little bit patient, like we saw with George Russell, who probably stayed a bit longer at Williams than he would have liked, but there was no room at the inn within Mercedes. So timing is definitely a key part, but being prepped and making sure that, either yourself, and I always believe that it's important to put yourself forward. You can have a manager, but at the end of the day, they're not signing the manager. They're signing you. So have the confidence to put yourself in front of the various decision makers.
How important was a manager? Because famously, Gerhard Berger says, I didn't want a manager because I wanted to keep all of the money for myself. You did, variously, IMG, huge agency behind you. Then you worked with Martin Brundle. What did a manager do for you that you couldn't have done yourself?
So I got introduced to IMG, which were, as you say, a big management agency of that era. They were working with Senna, Prost, Schumacher on some of his business. And it was through Paul Stewart Racing, Jackie Stewart's son's team, that they had a relationship with IMG for many years. Jackie had been managed by Mark McCormick, who's no longer with us. So I guess was part of them speculatively having some young drivers, which was, I guess, at the beginning of that curve. There's lots of management companies out there now that are managing kids in karting, offering them the dream. As long as you pay us some money, we will offer you the dream of future stardom. And it's a trading business that they're hoping that one of them comes through and proves to be successful. But I started into Formula One with IMG, which I don't really feel that they put me in a place to become a Grand Prix driver, because I'd been testing for Williams anyway. I tested in 90, 91, 92, 93. And in the beginning, I wasn't paid to test. I was just called up to go and do aero running and things like that. So it was let's say, a pretty low-level relationship. And then it became more formal. And then what happened in Imola, which no one could have predicted happened. And even then, you couldn't lobby Williams to put you in the car. And I actually remember saying to my manager, Tim Wright, at the time, after the weekend of Imola, saying, we don't speak, we don't call Frank or Patrick, the team know me. I've been testing for a few years. We're not going to be those people that are going, well, one of your drivers is no longer with us. We have a driver for you. And I felt very strongly that wasn't the thing to do. And I know that a number of drivers, of course, did reach out to the team, or managers had reached out to the team going, hey, you need a driver. And I think I think the approach was the right way. So eventually the team, once the emotion was understood and they got on with the business of going Grand Prix racing, they decided to put me in the car for a single race. It was that was it. I had to prove in that single race that I could be a servant to the team. And then that led to me sharing the car with Nigel Mansell over the course of, I did 8 Grand Prix in 94, which then led to the full-time drive. And what I believe took me to being a full-time Grand Prix driver from 95 onwards was my commitment. I was there at the factory. I was with the team. I was living close by. And I think Nigel, as an experienced former Grand Prix champion, he was sort of flying in from America. He'd come and do the race. He'd buzz out again. You know, he was in that routine of, well, you know what I can do, so I'm not going to stay around and sort of, you know, spend time with the team. But I think that's exactly what Williams needed at that time, through the emotion and the difficulty of 94, which was traumatic. You know, Roland Ratzenberger, of course, and then with Ayrton. I think the team needed a reset of sort of family commitment.
It seemed that you owned that relationship with Williams. So what was IMG doing for you then at the time?
Well, sorry to sort of hesitate. Difficult, of course, always to see what people are doing. Andrew Hampel was one of the senior people. Ian Todd, who went on to work with Nike. Tim Wright was my designated manager. He was keeping Formula One teams across my results in Formula 3000. I remember Patrick Head saying to him, look, can you stop sending letters? Which is what people did back then. Nowadays it would be an email. But so they were, I guess, lobbying the name and doing that kind of managerial side, but very difficult to sell or to find sponsorship for a young driver. So they weren't really doing that. They were, I guess, just, I remember Tim saying to Ron Dennis, you know, it'd be really nice if you gave David a watch. And I remember Ron going, well, why would I want to give David a watch? I was a Formula 3000 driver. And he's going, well, because then he'll really feel connected to you. And he's going, I run McLaren. He'll feel connected to me whether I do that or not. So there was probably some missteps in that process. But what was a sort of low point in that relationship, through the relations they had with Ayrton and Alain, they had a showy contract, both the drivers at that time, and they'd managed to leverage a helmet for me when I was in Formula 3 out of showy, and they brought that helmet to Brands Hatch when I was testing, and they took it out of the cover. And my helmet, as you will well remember, is a white cross on a blue helmet, blue background. It's the Scottish flag. It's called the Saltire. They took the helmet out. It was a blue cross on a white background, and I think that might be the Finnish flag or something, but they just...
They see that's really bad.
They just didn't get the importance of the crash helmet.
Yeah.
You know, helmets, as you know, are the most personal thing that the race driver has, and it's something that we really connect with. So when I ended up racing for Williams in 95, through into 96, I actually then wrote to Mark McCormack, had a multi-year contract, asking to come out of the contract because I just felt that I wanted something more racing-centric. I wanted something more personal to Formula One. I don't doubt that IMG, like all of these other big companies, would be commercially very good because that's the space they live in. But the money was never the motivation for me. It was, what is the best car that I can be in? What is the best environment I can be in?
This episode is sponsored by Shopify. One thing I've always admired about people who start their own businesses is that at some point they simply decide to give it a go. Of course, that comes with a few doubts as well. Whether it's launching a business or beginning a new project, there's always that moment where you think, what if this doesn't work? But sometimes all you really need are the right tools to help you get started, and that's where Shopify can help. Shopify gives you everything you need to get going in one place, from building your online store with ready-made templates to Shopify's built-in AI tools that help you write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your images. And it can help with your marketing too, thanks to email and social media tools designed to get the word out about your brand and help you find your customers. It's basically like having your own commerce expert at your fingertips, with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. It's time to turn those what-ifs into with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/beyondthegrid. Go to shopify.com/beyondthegrid. That's shopify.com/beyondthegrid. This episode is sponsored by Vanta. One thing nobody really tells you when you start a business is how much time can end up going into proving your company is trustworthy. Customers want reassurance around security, compliance, and risk management before they'll even consider working with you. And that can really slow deals down if you're not already across things behind the scenes. And that's exactly the kind of challenge Vanta is built to help with. Vanta automates your compliance process and brings compliance, risk, and customer trust together on one AI-powered platform. So whether you're preparing for a SOC 2 or managing a larger enterprise GRC program, Vanta helps keep everything organized and keeps your deals moving. Companies like Ramp and Writer spend 82% less time on audits with Vanta. So it's not just faster compliance, it's more time to focus on growing the business. And it's no wonder that over 10,000 companies from startups to large enterprises trust Vanta to help them prove security and build customer confidence. So get started at vanta.com/grid. That's vanta.com/grid. End of 95, you're in a Williams. You've just won your first Grand Prix at the Portuguese Grand Prix. And McLaren were having a torrid time, right? They just switched to Mercedes engines, and 95 was a real low point for them. So if you're trying to get yourself in the best car, why walk away from the best car?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. But we have to take a step back to 94. So numbers-wise, 1994, I did 8 races. So I was a test driver. I had a test driver contract for Williams, and I was being paid £30,000. A reasonable amount of money. In 1994, certainly probably better than people with a higher education were probably earning at that time. And then I did the 8 races where I was paid £5,000 a race, right? And so at the end of that year, I had been paid £70,000 to be a Grand Prix driver.
What was Mansell getting per race? Just out of
million per race. And which
did you know that at the time?
Of course, I heard the rumours and what have you. But anyway, again, I was never once was I complaining about money. But I did have a conversation with Frank at the Canadian Grand Prix in 1994, which is where I scored my first points, because the withholding tax agreement with Canada was a flat rate of 10,000 Canadian dollars for every driver. So whether you were Nigel or Ayrton or Schumacher or a young guy like me doing my second Grand Prix, you were obliged to pay 10,000 Canadian dollars as a withholding tax. Well, I was only earning £5,000, which was less than 10,000 Canadian dollars. So I went to Frank and said, Mr. Williams, could you please help me with the tax? Because otherwise I'm paying to be here at the Grand Prix. And he thought about it and went, no. So I effectively paid to score my first points, which is not unusual to have paying drivers in Formula One. You just don't associate that with Williams. So it's fair to say it was a little bit hand to mouth. I was still living, sharing a house, a rented house in Milton Keynes with some mechanics. And
Please tell me that Frank was paying your expenses.
yes, the flight and the hotel was paid. Yeah, absolutely. So by the end of that first year, and bear in mind, I had an overdraft debt of £320,000, which had been run up to race in Formula 3000. So at the end of that year, that 70,000, 10% of that would be going to the management. Some of it would be going to my, let's say, life expenses, and a little bit would be going to drawing down that £320,000 that I owed, which was secured against the family transport business. So we get to the end of the year, 94. We've agreed, so my management have agreed, a 2-year contract, 95, 96, to drive for Williams. We go at the end of 1994, December, to sign that contract. And as the lawyer's getting the paperwork out, so you see I was signing into the end of 96. Frank goes, I've changed my mind. I want to do a 1-year contract. So the lawyers go, oh, okay, so we've got to scribble out 90, 96. I take some time out with my manager to go into another office, and we call Ron Dennis, because Ron had approached us in 94 already to look at whether we were available to join McLaren. And we said, well, we're not, we're going to re-sign with Williams. So we phoned Ron, and Ron says, come to the factory, I'll sign a contract with you for 96.
Now.
Right, now. So we sign for 95 to drive for Williams. We go to Woking. We sign a contract for 96, 97 at McLaren, and I then drive up to Scotland to spend Christmas with my mum and dad. And I remember telling my parents, I'm going to be a Formula One driver for the next 3 years. And they were, oh, that's lovely. And I said, it'll be 1 year with Williams and 2 years with McLaren. And of course, they were like, how does that work? Well, it works because people change their mind. And then halfway through 95, Frank decides that he wants me for 96. And we're like, we're not available. And then he tries to use the contract recognition board to enforce the test driver contract, which was a multi-year contract that ran through until I think 98. And so this hopefully is not too confusing for the listener, but we had to go to the lawyer's office in Geneva, which is where all of the Formula One drivers' contracts are lodged at the contract recognition board. And I was racing for Williams, but I was sitting on the side of the McLaren lawyers and Martin Whitmarsh, who worked with Ron Dennis, whilst the lawyers of the contract recognition board looked at the paperwork that Williams had, looked at the paperwork that McLaren had, and decided that actually McLaren's contract was valid and that I would drive for them in 96, 97. I then went to the airport and flew with Frank, who was in the meeting, to the next Grand Prix. The whole thing was totally...
Can't make it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally unnecessary if Frank had signed ultimately the contract that we'd agreed at the end of 94. So I finished that year with Williams, and then the 1995 Adelaide, I'd been leading the Grand Prix, crashed out, as you recall. That cost £500,000 win bonus at Williams, and it cost me $2 million over my McLaren 96, 97. So it was an expensive crash. And I went to dinner that night with Ron Dennis and his ex-wife, and I'm sitting there on my own going, okay, right, so I'm now a McLaren driver. So that's how that came about.
You didn't walk away from the fastest car. You'd committed to McLaren before. Yeah,
absolutely. And I was committed to staying with the fastest car, but Frank changed his mind and then changed his mind again.
Was it an emotional decision to ring McLaren that day that Frank sort of reneged on the original deal?
Yeah, I was understandably disappointed that I'm there ready to sign a proper contract for 2 years with a team that I've been racing for, and they changed their mind. And I think the reason they changed their mind was because Damon Hill his lawyer was really pushing on trying to get Damon a big contract, and Frank probably just got to the point where he was going, well, drivers are me off, so I'll put them both in a 1-year contract. But the risk to him was he would lose me, and he did. The risk to me was I went to a less competitive McLaren for 96. I think did Damon win 96 and Jack won 97, but then 98, McLaren came good. So
Was
it took time.
that hard for you? Did you look over your shoulder a bit and go,
I went from leading...
That could have been me, maybe?
Yeah, I went from leading the last race of 95 in Adelaide, and then 4 months later, I'm sitting, I think, 14th on the grid in Melbourne. And at that point, the penny dropped, just what the difference in performance was. And so I do recall, not that I made the move for money, I made the move for security of contract, but I do remember at that point thinking, I will never make a move ever again based on, let's say, security or financial. It will always be only about performance. And you can never know 1 year to the next, of course, but you get trends of performance. So when you have big regulation change like we just had, it shakes everything up. But when you have year to year of stability, you do tend to see the same teams towards the front.
Right. What is a driver prepared to put up with in order to get in the best car?
Well, Ayrton Senna famously told when he was at McLaren, and Alain Prost was there in 93, he famously went in the media and said, I will drive for Williams for nothing. I'll drive for free. Yeah. Because, of course, that suddenly makes people go, oh, well, if we're not paying the driver X amount of million, that's money that we can invest in the team. So the engineers will like that. The team owner will like that. So I think someone who's really committed will do whatever it takes to get in the best car. Right. That's what I truly believe. And I spent 9 years with McLaren, and at various times they had the best car, and at various times it wasn't. The move to Red Bull was about unfinished business. I knew it wasn't the best car, but I truly believed I could play a part in helping develop and structure that team towards being a winning team in the future, which turned out to be the case. Yeah, the team did go on to be very successful. And that comes from an absolute belief that Formula One is always about people. It's always about people. If you've got the right group of people working together, it's not always about who's the biggest talent or who's got the biggest brain or the best degree. You've got to have people that've got a willingness to work together and to have each other's back. So for me, the most successful teams are a little bit like SAS or any form of special forces. No human gets left behind. They defend each other. And when you see teams break down, it's because you get little factions of, well, it's their fault, and that's when you no longer have a team.
Having been in the sort of straitjacket of McLaren for 9 years, did you enjoy the player-manager role? And was it liberating to go to Red Bull?
It was, in many ways, the right environment at the right time in my life. I was into my 30s. I had Formula One experience and knowledge. I had life experience. And I think that's the key thing that we don't always take into account when we're talking about drivers. Kimi Antonelli right now is leading the World Championship. Brilliantly fast, young talent. He's still a boy. You cannot make a man out of someone that hasn't had life man experiences. And you'll know as a parent and anyone else who's gone into the 30s, it doesn't make you quicker, but you're just more worldly. You're more capable of making decisions, of going, no, that doesn't work for me. That's how I'm going to get the best out of myself, and having the confidence in the environment that you're working. So that's why I think you don't judge somebody on a couple of race wins. You judge somebody on, can they handle the pace of a Grand Prix season? Can they do it back to back? We've seen brilliant drivers, people like Heinz-Harald Frentzen, who could win in a Jordan. He won one race in a Williams, which was a race-winning, championship-winning car. But somehow when the pressure of expectation comes, some drivers don't deliver. And when they're in, let's say, away from that spotlight, they extract performance from a car that you go, wow, that's impressive.
I always thought of Giancarlo Fisichella as another driver.
Fizzy. Montoya, brilliantly fast, doesn't give attitude, but came to McLaren, replacing me, spent a year, and then he was on his way again because it just didn't work out. So, drivers like that have got so much potential, but somehow don't manage, Daniel Ricciardo, brilliantly fast racing driver. But I think as he's now recognised, and he's done an interview this year talking about, he started to feel he was losing his way towards the end of his career, not because he was old, but he got distracted. He got distracted by what the world was offering him, where the key focus always has to be stopwatch, checker flag. They're your two North Stars in Formula One.
How difficult is it to maintain that focus as you get richer, as you get more famous?
Absolutely. It is difficult because you get used to people going, yes. And I remember I went from test driver at Williams being told what to do to being a Grand Prix driver, and the same people saying, David, would you mind? Could you please? And you start to go, hold on, I can say no. And you go, no, I don't want to do that. And they go, okay, no problem. Whereas when you're the test driver, you say no, they'll go, well, we'll get someone else to do it. Do you want to be the test driver? I never said no, is the point. But if I take that attitude of discovering what works for me within the Grand Prix paddock, when I had the confidence to go, that timing doesn't work. Can we move it? Because this will enable me to be better prepared. But yeah, for sure, you end up becoming a bit spoiled. And around 30 years old, I was in Formula One for several years. I was earning millions. I had the plane crash on an aircraft that I didn't need to be on. The aircraft that I was normally using was booked, let's say, for 2:00. I woke up early in London. I wanted to go back to Monaco. I got on the phone to my office, said, let's bring the plane earlier. And they were like, well, your aircraft isn't available. I said, find me another one. It's ridiculous. They find me another one. I turn up, say hi to the pilots. An hour later, the plane crashes. They're dead, and I'm going, okay. So maybe being a little bit more patient, a little bit more humble, a little bit less, me, could be a lifesaver. And that marked my moment of growing up, and then the next few years were my strongest years in Formula One.
I always thought you were very good at using the media. We had some great pre-season lunches at the Bluebird restaurant in London, didn't we?
Yes.
But perception is 9/10 of the law in this paddock, isn't it? If enough people say something, whether it's true or not, people will start to believe it. How did you use the media as a driver?
Well, I wanted to build personal relationships because my belief is that gives you the benefit of the doubt more often. So I didn't have the attitude of I don't want to talk to anyone and the media are the enemy. For me, it was we all work and live within this world, this ecosystem of Formula One. I've got one of the best seats in the house as a driver. How do I do everything in my power to make sure that I'm getting the best car, best opportunity, fulfilling my talent? And when things are not going so well, which will happen, how am I going to have the benefit of the doubt rather than immediately being blamed or it's the driver's fault? How do you build relationships with the people that are influential, and the media are influential? They are the voices of the sport that carry the news around the world. So yeah, I always placed importance on that.
And what have you learned about the media now that you're working in it that you wish you'd known when you were racing?
I wish I just had the wider knowledge and experience of how the words can craft opinion, and how some members of the media will use you to stimulate a story. So it could be going to Michael, going, David said that your driving's totally unacceptable, because he's going to go, well, I don't give a about him. He's just another guy that it makes up the numbers. So they can create attention, which is part of the remit to get a reaction. If everything's all smashy and nicey, then you're not really going to get the human element of reaction. And some drivers are very, Jack and Juan Pablo Montoya were always very much what you see is what you get. They had no problem to just blah, blah, blah. Where I was maybe a little bit more considered in my answers, a bit more diplomatic on occasion.
But would you drop a bomb with a friendly journalist, just if you're trying to put pressure on on Ron Dennis to give you a few more quid, or just change something in your contract for the following year? Might you go up to a journalist and say, yeah, I had a really interesting chat with Ferrari?
Sure, absolutely.
Did you do a bit of that? Even if you hadn't?
I'm not a liar, Tom. I'm not a liar. But sharing information with key people is part of the game. And you're telling something to a trusted journalist in confidence, but you absolutely know that off the record has a boundary, which you don't want that to be broken, but you know that you can then have something that's going to be, little rumours build. So yeah, it's part of the business of Formula One. Getting yourself in the seat is difficult enough. Staying there when everyone wants your seat, if you're not having good performance, it's the other driver manager's job to get in there and speak to the journalist going, well, David's not doing a good job. You'd be much better putting Damon in the car or whatever it happens to be. So that's part of the game. That's everyone looks so sort of friendly and all the drivers get along, but behind the scenes, they want each other's seat. They want to do whatever's necessary to get the best car.
Yeah, on that note, I think the paddock is more friendly now than it was in your day. Would you agree with that? I'm talking
100%.
About between the drivers.
Between the drivers.
There was animosity between some of you guys.
100%. Yeah, it's a lot friendlier, Formula One. And the paddock is a lot friendlier. And I think Red Bull brought that more openness when they started with the energy station and they started doing chilled Thursday nights where other team members could come to Red Bull's hospitality to have a coffee or have a drink at the end of work. And you could see it was, people like Ron Dennis were like, well, hold on, I don't want our guys going in there. It was very territorial.
That's a good word,
famously, I've only ever been in Ferrari's motorhome twice in 30 years. Once,
even now?
Yeah. I went in once to have a meeting with Jean Todt, and once because I was flying back to Switzerland with Michael. And after the race, he'd fallen asleep in his driver room and everyone's packing up. And I'm like, and so I said to them, well, you go in. So I was going in and said, Michael, we have to go. You need to wake up. So, because, I never, you just didn't go into rival teams' hospitalities. And even, working as I do in television, I'll go into, McLaren for a briefing, or I'll go into Red Bull because I still do show runs for them. But I never really go into other team hospitalities if I don't have a reason to go there to meet someone, because they've got their partners, their sponsors, whatever it is that they're doing that's important. They don't need me going in and getting in the way.
How did the meeting with Jean Todt go, by the way?
I ended up having a further meeting with him in Paris at his apartment near the Champs-Élysées to talk about a contract for them. And it was interesting because it was the same time when I was coming out of my IMG contract, and I'd asked Bernie Ecclestone to help me speak to the owner of IMG, whose name I've just forgotten right now.
Mark McCormack.
Mark McCormack. Because when on the level that I was talking to try and come out of my contract, they were saying, no, we have a contract, that's it. And I understood that I would have to pay something to leave the contract, but they just weren't entertaining the idea. So I went to meet with Bernie, asked him if he could speak to Mark McCormack on my behalf. And that coincided with the time I'd just come back from a meeting with Jean Todt in Paris. And Bernie said, so are you thinking about going to Ferrari? And I went, well, every driver would love to be with Ferrari at some point, but I think I'm happy at McLaren. I then left that meeting, went to have a meeting with my lawyers, and I get a call from Ron going, what's this? You want to leave and go to Ferrari? Bernie had spoken to him and, Jean Todt. They were manipulating the environment. And I was like, I don't want to go to Ferrari. I want to stay with McLaren. So, but it showed you that at that level, these guys all knew what was going on, and they were just, drivers are like the pawns, they move around.
This episode is sponsored by Lisa. I've talked a lot on this show about all the opportunities that come from travelling through the Formula One season, but I have to be honest, nothing quite compares to getting home and sleeping in my own bed again, which is why I'm delighted to be partnering with Lisa for this episode, because at home we've had our current mattress for far too long, and we've finally decided it's time to replace it. But to be honest, I didn't really know where to start. I just know that if a mattress is too firm or too soft, my back definitely lets me know about it. But Lisa's online sleep quiz was genuinely really helpful. It asks about things like sleep position, firmness, whether you sleep hot, and the sort of support that you need. And it pointed me towards the Sapira Hybrid. Medium firm, breathable, and designed with a combination of supportive springs and memory foam. It sounds perfect, and I can't wait to try it. Lisa mattresses are designed and assembled in the USA, and they've even been awarded Best Hybrid and Best Memory Foam mattresses by New York Times Wirecutter. Plus, they make the whole process really straightforward with free shipping, easy returns, and a 120-night sleep trial. So go to lisa.com for 30% off selected mattresses, plus get an extra $50 off with the promo code GRID, exclusive for our listeners. So that's Lisa, LEESA.com, promo code GRID for 30% off selected mattresses, plus an extra $50 off. And support our show and let them know we sent you after checkout. Lisa.com, promo code GRID. Can we talk about the lure of Ferrari then? I mean, is it true that every driver would like to race for Ferrari? At least contemplate the idea.
I never had this big passion for Ferrari growing up. You know, the British teams, as a young guy watching Formula One on television, I was drawn to the British teams. Even when Nigel went to Ferrari and had, you know, and he was revered. He won his first Grand Prix for Ferrari. It was, you know, it was an amazing story. But I think having raced a little bit in Europe in karting and the lower formulas, there was a comfort for me in British teams. And in British teams, we know, are international. You have every nationality working within them. But I think I felt a security of knowing what I was dealing with, that I would have been uncomfortable doing that at Ferrari. And I think for Lewis, it must be challenging. He spent all his life with British racing teams, and he's there within Ferrari, picking up the language, but not fluent in the language. You know, Charles is embedded. He's been there for some time. And it's just, the teams are so big now, no matter how much Lewis will tell us he's been at the factory and he's been on the simulator, to affect change and influence change in an organisation that large, I think just takes a long, long time. And I'm not sure he'll have the time to really make it the way he was able to, you know, be. I think Mercedes were shaped around his needs, and it was tremendously successful.
It's like they're like big oil tankers, these teams, aren't they? It takes a while to turn around. DC, when I think of the lure of Ferrari, I just always come back to Jean Alesi, who turned down the 1991 Williams. Of course, they went on to dominate.
Yeah.
I think he'd even signed a contract with Frank, actually.
I believe so, because I think Eddie Jordan was involved at that time.
Yeah.
So part of that deal, Frank got a Ferrari Formula One car out of releasing Jean to go to Ferrari. So I don't know which Formula One car that was in the Williams collection, but that was Frank's payoff for having had a contract with Jean, and Jean wanting to join Ferrari, that the Williams organisation got a Ferrari, an old F1 car, for their collection. So yeah, look, I get it with Jean, and Jean he's a great friend. His passion for motor racing is still very much there. He's the president of Paul Ricard Racetrack, so I'll be with him next weekend for the Paul Ricard Classic. He was racing in the Monaco Classic. I saw he had a little shunt in one of the Ferraris. Thankfully, he wasn't injured, but a little bit of damage to these incredibly expensive classic cars. But yeah, passion took him there. And as we know, the history books, he only had one victory in Montreal, but I'm delighted he did get a victory. But I think in terms of raw talent, he was one of the fastest guys out there.
Yeah. Engineering now. How much can a quick driver mask the deficiencies in a car?
I think the exceptionals. So they're all good in Formula One. And if the most arrogant statement you'll get out of me is to say I was a good Formula One driver. But sport is about exceptional. And the exceptionals are the names that we can all mention. You know, the Schumachers, the Hamiltons, the Verstappens, the Sennas, and anyone who's won multiple world championships. They're exceptional. You can win a world championship through being in the right place at the right time. And not to take anything away from Keke Rosberg, but he famously won a world championship winning one Grand Prix. You know, that's not historically what you associate with the greats of the sport, who get the scruff of the neck of the car and go on and win multiple Grand Prix. So how would you put a number on that? I guess you would have to average their performance relative to their teammates over the time they were in Formula One. People like Senna could be half a second or more, you know, famously a second quicker than Prost once in Monaco in a qualifying lap, but such was the advantage they had. I think Alain was still second on the grid. Actually, we spoke about this off air, I think last year, when Formula One was so close, the grid was covered by a second. There was one of the years, I think it was 99, Mika was on pole in Barcelona. I was second, and I was 7/10 slower. And Michael was third, and he was 7/10 slower than me. So the top three were covered by 1.4 seconds. The whole grid was like 4 seconds. We just come out of an era where the entire grid was covered by a second. So, this sport has evolved. But I think in terms of the greats, they've got to have a couple of tenths in their pocket. And I think if you actually break a couple of tenths down to a 5.5 kilometer racetrack with 19 or 20 corners, the corners obviously is where they influence that. It's tiny, tiny amounts of time. We're talking thousands of a second in every single corner that makes them exceptional. So we're not talking that they're just stronger and they can bench press an extra 20 kilos. The mind controls the body. Their mind is able to process the feeling of grip visually as they approach the corner, and then physically when they're in the corner, when the car's at the limit of adhesion, they just do it better. And it's tiny margins that makes exceptionals.
You talk about processing, right? Would you agree that all the greats are bright, have a strong intellect?
I think it's a different kind of brightness, because you could look at a Nigel Mansell and his communication style with the team when things weren't going well was quite blunt instrument. It was quite, very often you'd see him ranting at his engineer on the pit wall and storming off, throwing his gloves into the crowd. It was
emotional.
not. Yeah, it was an emotional.
Emotional unintelligence, actually.
But you've got to have bravery. You've got to have commitment. You've got to have belief. You've got to have the intelligence to understand how to work the political system in the garage, because you're constantly lobbying the new development. You want it on your car. The team may rationalise putting it on the other car because they're ahead of you in the championship, or the risk is it doesn't work and you are being supported. But you've got to know which battles to fight. And the battles you're fighting as a young driver is against people like Frank Williams or Ron Dennis, people who've been around a long time and they've negotiated with some very successful drivers. But you learn. If you really want to be the best you can within your environment, you figure out what are the things. Like I figured out the way to soften Ron was to have any conversation starting talking about family, talking about his family. If I could get his family in his mind, who he famously kept away from the Formula One paddock, you could see him disarm. And then I would get into the conversation of what I needed, what I wanted, I was there to try and get something out of the conversation. Adrian knew the way to get Adrian to work at Red Bull was through his ex-wife. And I'm sure his wife today is very influential, because Adrian is very, very much a focus engineer on his creative skills, and a lot of other things probably not so important to him. So you learn how to get the best out of people. That's part of the role. How do I soften someone to get what I want? How do I move someone to one side because they're getting in the way of what I need in my performance? So it's a political game as well as being a racing driver game.
You could do that brilliantly. Do you think the Verstappens, the Hamiltons, the Leclercs are doing it as well?
I have to believe they're doing it, because they're all at an incredibly high level. I think that Lewis has his emotional intelligence. He's clearly an incredibly talented race driver, but he's a softer personality than a Nigel Mansell in his approach. We all famously remember Ayrton with absolute commitment doing interviews where he is, the fact that there's a room of people around when he's connecting with the person that he's making the point to, he's on you, and you would feel that
drilled in,
because that was commitment. So they all have their different way of positioning themselves within a team. But I'm not going to say that any of them are going to suddenly, re-engage with university and come out with a degree. But I think that there's a social intelligence, a human intelligence, and obviously an ability to feel the edge of adhesion.
And that processing. Just go back to the marathon. I was stunned with how much information Vettel could absorb and remember, just talking about his training program and stuff.
We remember anything that will give us performance. Things that will not give us performance, we forget. No interest. But anything that is going to give a technical edge or a small edge, that's there, ready to be pulled.
I know we're here to talk about drivers, but just in the last half hour or so, it's really struck me. Why are you not running a Formula One team? And I'm actually asking you a serious question there, because you get the sport, you get the politics, you get how to get the best out of people.
Well, maybe I will one day. But right now I'm doing what I'm doing. Yeah.
Would that interest you?
Yeah, of course. Of course. I love the sport. And but right now my skills are deployed in the areas that I've chosen over the last few years, beyond what I do within the paddock with television. Then I'm a shareholder in Whisper, which is one of the fastest growing production businesses over the last 15 years. I'm involved with Velocity Experience, where we were doing the McLaren event down in downtown Miami this weekend. We were doing some work with San Pellegrino at another place. We work with VistaJets. We are across a number of the partners. And
you're too busy to run a Formula One team, these.
Well, I'm busy with all of those things as well. So you cannot be, to use a Jackie Stewart expression, you cannot be a little bit pregnant. You've either got to be fully committed, or, as I am with my partners in my other businesses, I fulfill the role that I can to help enhance those businesses, and they get on with their skill set, the leadership skills that they have to run the businesses.
Look, I know you got to go. I've got two more questions, if I may. One is, okay, looking at the 26 grid, the silly season, driver silly season is going to kick off. It gets earlier and earlier, doesn't it? Who is the most sought after driver in Formula One? Who is the first domino to fall, and then everything else slips into place afterwards? Who are we waiting for?
Well, I think Ferrari, we're waiting on Lewis, obviously, to decide if his year continues as it started. Then I suspect that he'll naturally want to keep going, because he's done a great job in the first few Grand Prix. Time stands still for nobody, but as we're seeing with Fernando at 44, 45, just become a dad, then he's not being at all outperformed by Lance within that team. So the longevity that drivers have nowadays, I think, is absolutely clear. It's about motivation and energy rather than whether they've got the speed and the talent. So I think Lewis is a key domino to fall, and that will, I believe, directly influence what happens for Ollie Behrman. Then if that happens, then that frees up an opportunity within Haas, and then maybe there's a Formula 2 driver that's got the opportunity to come in. I think the other existing drivers, it's in Max's hands whether he stays or goes, whether he takes a year out or not. Any of those things are a possibility, but we will find out when they make that decision. And I think that the other sort of key teams, Williams hasn't started out the way they wanted. Therefore, I've got to imagine that a Carlos and an Alex are looking at what are the other options. They've gone from kind of there to there. So they've got to be considered too. One is a Grand Prix winner. The other one has shown his speed and performance over the last few years. So all of them will be looking for where are the next steps. What is the possibility? Is somebody going to be dropping out of Formula One, or are you going to be able to negotiate your way into that team?
Right. And the last question then, you talked about performance trends earlier. Put your racing driver head on. Which team would you commit the next 3 years of your life to?
Well, it would seem obvious to say that what we're seeing perform right now, we're into this new set of regulations. Mercedes are up and running. So there's a absolute safe.
Safe for the next 3 years?
Yeah, I believe so. But your big four are quite clearly where the safe places are. So Mercedes, McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull have slipped obviously to be at the bottom of that pecking order right now, but they could very quickly move forward again because their power unit seems to be performing. So it's about unlocking the chassis performance. And then it's a mix of teams in that next grid, isn't it? Your Haas's, your Audis, Williams have obviously got potential because where they are right now, I don't think is reflecting the DNA of that team. Cadillac is a long-term play, coming as a complete startup. So I don't think I've probably said anything that you wouldn't have put your finger on. But right now, George and Kimi are in the World Championship pound seat. The World Championship is going to one of those two drivers if the continued trend of performance in the first 3 Grand Prix plays out. McLaren showed well, so they may get in the mix. I don't see Mercedes winning everything. And of course, Ferrari, we know that Charles is one of the fastest drivers on the grid, and Lewis seems to be, born again. He's got an energy and right there knocking on the door. So there's a lot to be excited about.
DC, such a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for coming on the show again.
Thank you.